Um, I'm Emma Schmidt, for those of you who don't know me, but it looks like everybody does. And we are our thing that we're wanting to do is once a month provide a free webinar for the community to answer any questions that you all have. So how and when to talk to your kids about sex is one of the #1 topics that we hear across the board that people are wanting more information about. So how to do that, what that looks like. A lot of us weren't modeled how to do that. And so Julie and Justin have taken into consideration all the questions that we've heard and have gotten in, and they've created a presentation on answering those questions. So what will happen is they will answer those and give a brief overview of how to do that and what that looks like. And then they will also answer some questions at the end and then provide a giveaway at the end. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. Not a free. So along the way, feel free to put in questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A section at the bottom. If you see at the bottom, there's a Q&A, or you can do it in the chat as well, and we'll make sure that we add those questions at the end of the webinar. So I will pass it on to you all.
Thanks, Emma.
Yeah.
So again, I'm Julie.
I'm Justin.
And so we are both interns here at Emma's practice. So we also do sex and therapy relationship. And so, and relationship therapy. And so, like Emma said, we are really looking forward to just talking with how and when to talk to your kids about sex. Again, this is just super important. But before we dive in, just to give you a little snapshot of who each of us are, I am getting ready to wrap up my master's program at Cincinnati Christian University. So really looking forward to December. It could not have come soon enough. And then when I graduate, my passion and desire is to become a certified sex therapist and sex educator. So to continue doing things like this, talking to people about sex and how do we make ourselves more well-informed about this, because it's such a hush-hush topic in our society. And so just really wanting to give a voice to that. And that'll probably come through in our presentation as well as to why that's important.
Yeah, and I have similar aspirations to Julie. My master's program will finish up in about May of 2018. And I also want to move forward with the AASEX certificate in sex therapy, as well as the certificate in sex education. I'm actually in supervision right now for the education piece. I work for, outside of my internship, I work for a nonprofit that's statewide that does a lot of stuff with LGBTQ individuals, addressing health disparities. And so I bring some of that into this when we kind of have these conversations. With that, I've done some work with young people as in terms of like risk reduction, sexual risk reduction, with sexuality in the context of like sexually transmitted infections, unplanned pregnancy, things like that.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and that's true. And so in terms of my credibility as well, I used to go to junior high and high schools and talk to kids a lot about not only the physical, but the emotional side of sex with a nonprofit. So good point into why I have any credibility at all. So just to dive in then, we are going to get started with the slideshow, so feel free to follow along. Like Emma said, if you have any questions, just toss them in either the chat or the Q&A box, and at the end, we'll try and save some time to answer any questions that are untouched. But just bearing in mind that we only have a little bit of time, and so we're going to try and provide as much information as we can in a really short span of time. So we acknowledge up front that we might not touch on a ton of specifics. We're trying to give a good general overview, and then in the future we'll try and do some smaller vlogs that'll address some of the more specifics, but feel free to ask us anything and we'll do our best to answer those as we go. So how and when to talk to your kids about sex? First things first, why? Why do we even talk to our kids about sex? Well, they're going to learn that information somewhere, right? We're all curious about it because at some point most people in their lifetime will engage in it on some level. And so if they're going to learn it from somewhere, you may as well be the front runner for that information. So you're the first person to set that standard about what is and isn't okay. You want to make sure that you're giving them the information that you really value. You're setting the stage for their lives. And so you're providing family values, and sex is not excluded from that. And so you want to make sure you're talking to them about it. And additionally, when you look at a lot of different research about talking to kids about sex, almost all kids report that they wish that their parents would either talk to them about it or would talk to them even more, that they would like to be able to ask even more questions. So kids are curious, even if they're not truly asking. And so you want to make sure that as the front runner for your kids, that you are providing that information. So just beginning in childhood, from birth to present, what do you do? So really, when you're talking to your kids about sex, you can start right off the bat. At age 0 to 2, you can already start having those conversations. What does that even look like? Really paying attention to vocabulary. Children's sexuality begins at the very beginning because they're just curious about their body parts. Just like a child would look at their hands in awe or their feet in wonderment, they're also going to explore other parts of their bodies, their belly buttons, but also the other parts as well. And so that includes the penis, the vagina, the vulva, the testes, all those different parts. And so you want to be giving them the proper vocabulary. Why is that? A lot of times parents will use vague words like pee-pee or cookie or something to describe a child's private parts. But really what we find is that as kids get older and even as adults, that there's a lot of shame and fear around using those words. You know, people whisper penis because they're so afraid of it, or they get, you know, they get all red in the face. But you want to decrease as much shame around someone's body as possible. These are parts that have been given to us, whether it's by God, whatever your faith base is, like this is your beautiful body, right? And so you want to own it and love it and appreciate it. And so by labeling those parts properly from the get-go, you're going to decrease a lot of shame. Also, safety is mentioned there. And the reason I say that, and Jocelyn provided me a great example a couple weeks ago, in court cases, if kids are not able to label and identify, like in the case of sexual abuse, there was a case where a child was not able to label the part that someone had inappropriately touched, and so the case had to get thrown out because they weren't able to say definitively, yes, this was inappropriate, because she didn't have the proper vocabulary to say this is what happened to me. So it's a safety component as well. And so when you're talking to your kids about that, you want to make sure that you're comfortable saying those words as well. Again, like I said, not everybody is raised saying those words, and so you might feel uncomfortable. But you are a model for your child, and so if they see you being like, well, that's your penis, or like looking nervous or anxious, then they're going to see that, and they're going to think, oh, that's not really something I should talk about, or I should be, you know, shy about. So you go and you practice saying it too. Play the penis game with your spouse, you know, where you start saying really quiet and you shout it in your house, or go into the bathroom and say vulva. You know, make sure that you're practicing saying those words and that you're comfortable with it, so that when you talk to your kids, that they're comfortable with it as well. And again, making sure that, again, labeling those parts properly, because a lot of people will say vagina to describe a woman's private area. But really, the vulva is what we see. And so the vagina is actually just the canal, you know, where like the birthing canal and all that is. That's the vagina. So the vulva is actually the external part that we see. Okay. And so with that, you know, little kids are curious. And from the ages of 2 to 11, it's very common for you to catch your child at some point playing with their penis or their vagina. They're curious about it. So they might be self-stimulating, or as other people call it, masturbation. And so if you catch them doing that, how do you handle that? What do? You just want to make sure that you're not panicking, that you're not shaming your child, because again, this is their body. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but maybe that's not an activity that you want them to engage in the middle of the grocery store. And so instead of slapping their hand or saying, this is not what good girls or good boys do, because then they're going to come away with a message of, you know, something like whether that's my body is bad or this is bad. Instead, talk to them about, you know, there's a difference between public and private space. So this is your body. And some parents might choose to say, you know, it's okay for you to do that, but in the privacy of your bedroom, we don't want other people seeing that. Or some parents may say, you know, this is not something that we want to do, but if you have questions about it, please ask me. I know that that feels good, but let's talk about why for us that may not line up with our family values. So doing it in a way, again, that's non-shaming. It's really a conversation with your child. And again, talking about that public versus private space. There's some parents who are super liberal and they're like, do whatever, wherever. But you also don't want someone who feels like they can just flaunt their sexuality everywhere too. Again, talking about this is a private space. And so you want to make sure that you're doing that in the comfort of your room, you know, no one else is around kind of thing. So those are all just ideas about how to talk to your kids, even in the early stages, and using proper vocabulary and decreasing shame. along with that comes consent. You want to be teaching consent from the very beginning as well. And so a great model for consent is actually asking your child, may I give you a hug? May I give you a kiss? Would you like to hug grandma? And the reason for doing that is it gives them autonomy and control over their own body, you know, instead of just, I'm going to hug you. I'm going to give you permission and control over your body so that in the future, if somebody's trying to be inappropriate with them, they know that they have the freedom and the right to say, no, thank you, not right now, and that they can use their words to say in the future, you know, why that's not okay for them. And again, just making sure that they know that they have the freedom to say, no, thank you, not right now. And then talking to family members about that too, modeling that of, hey, just saying up front, would you like to give grandma a hug? And maybe that hurts grandma's feelings and you talk to her on the side later of, hey, this is why we're teaching her this or him this right now, but just so that they're aware. And then discussing with them moments when it is appropriate for someone to touch them. So good touch and bad touch can be a little bit vague, so you want to be specific of, this is an area that is specifically yours and nobody else should touch that. So nobody else should touch your penis or your vagina, again, without your permission. And especially, you know, if you're at the doctor, mommy, daddy should be present, and there should be some sort of permission given. And so being a little bit more specific than this is good and this is bad, because that can just get confusing for a child. So just being a little bit more specific so that there's no confusion. If they come to you and say, somebody did something to me, you know exactly what it is that happened. And a big question that we get is, what happens if I catch my child playing doctor with another child? What do I do if I walk in and, you know, they're peering at each other's parts or something? And again, the natural gut reaction is somebody like, stop, don't do it, da da da, and to panic. But again, you don't want to send a shame message because at some point they're going to want to explore that. And so really taking the time to take your child aside, you know, and say, did you want them to touch you there? And, you know, so what were your feelings about it? Giving them permission to talk about it so that they then, as your child, feel like, oh, this is safe to talk to mom and dad about. I don't have to hide it or make it a secret. And then at that point, you can instill your own values of what you would or would not want them to do. Of course, I'm not saying let children go rampant or anything like that. But again, if your idea is abstinence only, or if you have a different idea of in the future what you would like your kids to do, that's a great moment to have that conversation about, this is what we really value in our family when it comes to sexuality and what we think about it. It's a great moment. It's a good teaching moment. And again, it sets a standard for sexual behavior in the future because they're learning, I can have a conversation with somebody about my sexuality. If I'm married in the future, I don't have to avoid that conversation. We can actually talk about it. And so in childhood, as they get older, you want to just continue being present with them with this. And so we know that a married couple isn't always just a married couple. Sometimes they're divorced, or sometimes they're, you know, have a previous spouse or anything like that. And so regardless of your relationship status, you want to model what a healthy relationship looks like. So that means being unified with your partner on decision making, using we messages. So instead, when you're describing what is sex or how do babies happen, instead of saying, well, daddy puts his penis in mommy's vagina, you can say, we place daddy's penis in mommy's vagina. It's a together activity. There's consent involved. Someone gave someone else permission, right? And again, of course, if you're divorced, avoid talking negatively about your ex in front of your child. You want to model, what does a healthy relationship really look like? How can we foster unity as best we can, even around sexual conversations? And the reason why this is so important is because predators can pick up on vulnerable children. They're aware of the children who appear to be neglected or who haven't received a lot of attention from mom and dad. And so they end up being like the cool adult with knowledge, or the cool older, you know, kid in the neighborhood with knowledge about sex, or who's willing to listen. And so by being open and being present with your children, you're also helping just create a sense of safety all around for them, publicly and at home. Okay. And then the last thing in terms of childhood before we move into adolescence is puberty begins between 9 and 11 for girls, 10 and 14 for boys, but this can happen sooner for some and later for others. And so you want to be preparing your kids in advance. You don't want to wait until one day a little girl has blood in her underwear and she's like, what do I do with this? Or, you know, a little boy is sprouting hairs or something. You want to have that conversation with them in advance and make sure that they're prepared and know, again, that they can come and talk to you about it. We've all been through puberty. We all know that it's scary and probably wish we had someone to talk to about it if we didn't. And so just starting that conversation early to say these changes may occur or they will occur. And when they do, come talk to me and I'm happy to walk you through that and what you need to do. So that way you're normalizing it and they're not freaking out when it happens. And when they see other kids changing, they're not confused or they're not shaming them or anything of that nature. So that's a little bit of childhood. I'm going to let Justin take over for adolescence.
Yeah. Can we switch the
Yes.
video to this one?
Yes.
That way I'm not all over.
Yes. Oh, wait. Just use mine.
Okay. Can you make it so I can?
Oh, do you want to see
Give us
yourself?
1 second. Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. So as we move out of childhood and into adolescence, right, I think that we can recognize based off the last slide that this is not something that happens over the course of a day. This is kind of a process for young people. And so there are some other things that we want to discuss. So boundaries with other young people is one of them. As people start to go through, as people's bodies start to go through changes and they start to interact with other people whose bodies are also going through changes, that can look really different depending on a lot of factors. We talked about in childhood a moment ago the importance of the conversation around consent and why it's important that the young people in your lives develop that sense of autonomy early on. So a lot of that is for the subtext, right? Not so much that grandma is going to, by hugging our sons or daughters, is going to do something detrimental to them. But some of that subtext can read as, grandma loves you, so we want to let grandma give you a hug to show you that she loves you. And so some of those messages can translate into adulthood as things like, people who love you are able to touch you to show you how they love you. And so these aren't necessarily at the front of our minds. These are not things that we are consciously aware of, but there's some of those messages that can lead to things as these young people start to become teenagers and then subsequently become adults. So boundaries with other young people, it's really important that we establish things and have the conversations around what does it mean for you and your friend to be playing doctor when we are young kids, and how does that look when we're 12? What does that look like when your son or daughter may be starting to experience sexual thoughts, feelings, urges, but their best friend hasn't hit puberty yet, and maybe some of those thoughts, feelings, and urges haven't started for them. And so this innocent piece becomes kind of different as one of them may develop at a different rate. And so being able to have that conversation around the consent with even something as simple as hugging as a child can work to teach those messages early on. When we get to consent is one of those conversations that is always really important to have with everyone. We see a lot of pieces about a lack of knowledge of consent in the news pretty regularly. Excuse me. And so being able to structure that conversation with the young people that consent is continually required, that it's not just a lack of a no, that it's an enthusiastic yes and a continued enthusiastic yes. So if I say yes to Julie and then 20 minutes from now I decide I'm done with my yes to Julie, then Julie and I know that that's the end and we're kind of done. So a lack of shaming messages, right? So trying to not use that shaming language. So the example when Julie and I were preparing for this that came to mind most easily was the example of Kleenex, right? So if let's say that your son, for example, starts going through 2 or 3 boxes of Kleenex over the course of a month, before they maybe had one for a year, structuring that conversation, if you feel it's necessary to have it all, structuring that conversation in such a way that's not shaming. So maybe forget about the jokes of, oh, you're going through a lot more Kleenex now, aren't you? And things like that, because some of those can not only cause the young person to kind of feel shame and guilt, but it can also hinder your ability to have conversations with them in the future. And so when we get to some of the other pieces with this, yeah, so with some of the other pieces around adolescence, so have those conversations frequently. I know that for a lot of the parents in my life, the talk is something that is kind of perceived as, well, we're going to do this once right now, and then we're done. We're not really going to talk about this again. And that's not necessarily the most productive path to take. So being able to have those conversations regularly will give your young person the opportunity to come to you if they have questions, rather than have it feel like a very formal, we're going to sit down at the dining room table, we're going to schedule this 45-minute conversation, I'm going to bring diagrams, it's going to be great. Being able to have that conversation in a way that feels more relaxed and open for them. That way they know that if they hear something at school and they just don't understand, or maybe it doesn't feel right for them, they can come to you and have those conversations and ask those questions. So we definitely also want to make sure that we avoid overreacting. And sometimes this can be really hard, because if we hear things about our children, we want to protect them. We want to make sure that they are safe and cared for. And so sometimes if someone's done something to, or we perceive someone's done something to our young person, we can have a lot of strong emotions around that. And it can sometimes be overwhelming for a young person to see that if that's something they're not used to. Especially since we know that young people are in a decent period of development, right? Between 10 and 20, a lot of changes happen. And so they may already be struggling with emotions their own around whatever it is they're bringing to you. And so it can be important to make sure that we are kind of responding at the same emotional level that they are. And then, so providing the opportunities to chat with providers. I mentioned earlier that my background is in healthcare, specifically working with LGBTQ populations. I'll get a little bit more about that in a couple slides, but being able to, as Julie mentioned earlier, have the conversation with children about mommy and daddy, or mommy and mommy, or daddy and daddy, or just mommy, or just daddy, whatever that parent situation looks like. Being in the room with the provider is really important. As your child progresses into adolescence, sometimes they may not feel super comfortable having you in the room for some of those conversations, especially when we get into young people maybe going into sports and needing to get a physical for the first time. Some of those things may be more comfortable for them if you're not in the room. And so giving them the opportunity to have open dialogue with their providers and making sure that the provider is aware of them and kind of the cultural context that they and you bring to the table. So if I'm going in with my mom to the doctor's office, I probably wouldn't bring her in if they're going to ask me to be naked. Granted, I'm substantially older than an adolescent, but it's kind of the same idea, which sometimes can be a little challenging because we can see this adolescent as still a child, right? They're our baby. We've seen them since they were really little. We held them when they were an infant, but now they're growing up. And so allowing them that space to have some autonomy can be really helpful and really empowering as well. So now the piece that I am a lot more used to, talking about sexual risk. So I want to highlight, I'm not just going to talk about physical sexual risk. So a lot of times we think about that and we think of sexually transmitted infections like gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, things like that, but also the emotional risks, right? So the first time that a child or a young person has a breakup, what does that mean for them? And what is the role of you really in their lives at that point? So going through in the way that I have that laid out, so safer sex practices, where are some places that you know to go to find those? I can't tell you how many 20-year-olds I teach how to put on a condom for the first time. And so that can be really valuable, but for a lot of the people, a lot of the individuals, knowing what safer sex practices are available to them culturally as well as just pure access. So it's important that these conversations are really based in a medical, factual world. So we want to make sure that when we are teaching the young people certain things, that the things that we're teaching them are based in kind of facts. And so when we look at cultural contexts, there are many different places that have preferences on safer sex practices. And so that's something that you kind of, as the parent, have to navigate on your own or with your partner or with us in session. That's not something that I can really tell you how to navigate through a webinar where I'm just kind of talking at the screen. But for the purposes of this, we're going to assume that condoms are on the table, and I'm going to kind of go over the whole breadth of sexual risk and safer sex practices. So when we look at condoms, access to condoms, if you are not comfortable as the parent talking to your young person and saying, I'll go get you condoms, we can go to Walgreens together, right? Maybe the young person might not find that comfortable. There are many resources where the young person can get those supplies on their own. So when we look at the easiest one that I'm aware of is going to be the Free Condom Project. That's essentially anyone in the state of Ohio can get 25 condoms mailed to them once a month, and they can get that recurring, or they can just get it one time. And that really is something that can be really valuable for adolescents, especially we're going to talk on a later slide about autonomy. And so if that's something that's on the table for you, recognizing obviously the cultural considerations, that may be something that could help make your young person a little more comfortable. There are also more specific when we look at sexually transmitted infections, so staying more biological, there's some specific things that we can look at that can prevent some of those things. So there are certain vaccines that people can get against a couple STIs. There are some things that are important to at least mention for some of those. Pre-exposure prophylaxis in the context of HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. There's a vaccine for hepatitis B, the Gardasil vaccine for HPV, which we know is linked to a lot of cancers and things like that. And as we go through all of this, I want to just touch on a minute. If you see me looking over to the right side, or maybe your left, we have the chat line open. So if you have questions, feel free to put those in there, and we'll get to those at the end. And so when we bounce down, the importance of having the conversation around safer sex practices, people between 15 and 24, which is really that adolescent piece that we're going to kind of hone in on, they account for about 1/4 of the sexually active population. So of all the people having sex, 1/4 of them are between the ages of 15 and 24, but they own half of new STIs. So new sexually transmitted infections that are diagnosed are about half of them are in people between 15 and 24. And so even if the idea of our kids growing up and having sex is a little frightening, sometimes the idea of helping them not just navigate a sexual debut, but also navigating things like a sexually transmitted infection can be a little more overwhelming for them. And so moving out of just physical risk into emotional risks as well. When I work with young people, I like to talk about healthy relationships a lot and what that means for that young person in that moment. And so what does a healthy relationship look like? How do we communicate that to children and especially adolescents? So I noticed a lot when I was going through some of the different research that there can be this fear, and this may be something that you've experienced or maybe something that you haven't experienced, but there can be this fear of almost an imposter syndrome. So you can see this sometimes with divorced parents, parents who maybe have not or were not married. This idea that if I can't have this perfect relationship, how can I tell my kid about what a good relationship looks like? And so it's not necessarily always about being this perfect role model 100% of the time, and you have to be on it. A lot of adolescents will value authenticity to a point, right? We mentioned earlier in Julie's piece, we don't want to be arguing or talking negatively about our partners or ex-partners, things like that. But being able to use a not healthy relationship as a learning experience, and being able to leverage maybe your child just had their first breakup. Maybe you see their first breakup looming on the horizon. Being able to have that conversation with them in a way that supports them, doesn't make them feel guilty, and then also helps them understand that this sucks, right? This might not be fun for them, but how can what did we learn? Because there's this piece about all life experiences have value, right? And we can learn something from those. And then I wanted to just touch a minute on some health disparities, just because that's kind of where professionally the realm that I live. So LGBTQ plus the spectrum of LGBTQ people, as well as minority populations, and not just race, but also things like socioeconomic status, can all be linked to sexual risk. And so we know that people who are living in poverty, racial minority populations, and also LGBTQ plus people tend to have higher rates of a lot of things when we look at negative health outcomes. So STI rates, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of suicide, things like that. And so being able to have that conversation and open that dialogue with young people, and this again ties back to some cultural context, right? But affirming your young person and being able to have the conversation with them around, I will love you no matter what. And being able to do that can be incredibly helpful and can act to insulate them to some of the emotional risks that kind of carry throughout the rest of their experiences. So, in a nutshell, adolescents, it's important to discuss healthy, respectful relationships. Why is that important for them? Why is it important for them to have a healthy and respectful relationship? As an adult, sometimes this conversation can feel weird. We want young people to just know it. We are told from society, the media even, our culture is one that kind of anticipates when we're ready to have sex, we'll just know it and it will be perfect and we'll know what goes where and what feels good and everything. All of those pieces will just fall into place. And it's not something that we do for a lot of other areas, right? We don't give a young person a car and say, you'll figure it out. It'll be fine. Just go ahead and drive on down the road and we'll see what happens. And sometimes that can be what we do with sexuality for young people. So discussing healthy and respectful relationships and why it's important to be respectful in a relationship. Communicate expectations. If there is a difference between having a conversation about sexuality with your young person and telling them that you want them to go have sex, a lot of times those can seem like they're like this, but they're not. They're two different conversations. So let them know, I'm giving you this information. I'm not telling you that I want you to go out and have sex tomorrow, but I am telling you that I want you to be respectful in the relationship that you choose to be in. I want you to, if you're going to have sex, do it safely, and then really think about what that means for you and what that means for that relationship. It's kind of going back to the car example. If we give the young person the license, but maybe don't have them read the book, maybe don't teach them how to drive the car, but we're giving them, we don't want to talk about them driving the car, so we're just going to give them the license and then not think about it again. And so that's when you compare it to driving a car, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So when we look at adolescent sexuality, we want to make sure we're preparing them, but that doesn't automatically mean that we're telling them to go out and have sex. Provide accurate factual information. So in my conversations with young people on probation and in schools, I hear a lot of things that just aren't true. So some of those ranging from how to tell if someone has gonorrhea by using earwax. There's this whole thing that I have a lot of young people share with me, different STIs that don't actually exist. And so providing resources to the young person can be really important, because if we as parents and you as parents are not providing those resources, or at least providing access to resources they're going to get the information from their friends, from, different TV shows, things like that. And so when we're doing that, it's important to have accurate information. And if you don't have the information, or if you feel as though the information that you may have, you're not 100% sure about, we're going to provide some resources, both in a follow-up vlog and also in a minute about what some of those pieces can be and where you can go to find that information. So it's also important to focus on benefits, not consequences. And so what is the benefit, what is the benefit to having a healthy relationship? What is the benefit to using appropriate language when we're talking about body parts, rather than what can go wrong if we don't do this? I'm not a huge fan of fear when we talk to young people about sexuality. That's a personal thing. But some of those pieces can be a little more affirming and a little less shaming if we're focusing on the benefits of a healthy relationship versus the consequences of a non-healthy relationship. And then provide opportunities for growth. So we want to make sure that we're able to be in tune with what our young person needs. If they are really checked out of that minute where you're trying to show them how to put a condom on, a banana or a cucumber or a demonstrator tool, if they're really not engaged, maybe there's a different way to give them, to transfer that message. Is it a demonstration video? Is it setting them up with someone at a local public health department or HIV AIDS service organization that can show them how to do some of those pieces? If sitting down at the kitchen table and having that conversation is not working for the young person, maybe start that conversation up in the car. Eye contact can certainly make some people uncomfortable. I see this a lot in session, even with non-adolescents. And so having a conversation around a subject, maybe if the young person in your life is 13 and you were not able to kind of have some of those conversations early on that Julie kind of talked about, it may be a little uncomfortable for them. And so not making direct eye contact where they're able to kind of tune out if it gets overwhelming is one option. A couple other things that you can try if that's the case: having that conversation right after a movie that's impactful. So Emma and I were having a conversation this morning about HIV and some other STIs, mostly because that's where I kind of live professionally. And we talked about a movie called The Normal Heart. And so if that's something you're sitting around and a movie comes on that's kind of related to sexuality, kind of related to healthy relationships, and you're thinking to yourself, this is relevant to something that might be going on in their lives, or this somehow can be something that I could translate to be relevant. Have that conversation then. Say, hey, what did you think about that? What was that movie like for you to watch that? That might be a little weird at first for you and them, but giving yourself permission to be uncomfortable and naming that discomfort can also be really helpful. If your young person's uncomfortable and you're uncomfortable and it's weird for both of you, name it. Let them know, like, yeah, this is kind of weird for me too, but I think it's important. Are you cool if we kind of continue this discussion? Is there a better time? Being transparent and authentic with them can help build some more of that relationship that you sometimes that can sometimes be a little difficult when we're talking about topics that are socially taboo, especially like sexuality. And so we are moving on to the question and answer portion. What questions do you have for us, both about the material, other burning questions you've been dying to ask us about adolescent sexuality, or how to have that conversation?
And you can put that in the chat, or you can put that in the Q&A box. And somebody already asked if there are kids' books to help them learn about sex. There definitely are. We're going to send out an email just because I can't remember all authors' names off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. So we'll send an email when this is all said and done, and we'll include in there a list of some resources for you, books-wise, for you as a parent, for the kids to reference as well. That would be helpful. So yeah, we'll definitely get those resources to you. And I think Justin will do a little vlog on some other resources as well.
Mm-hmm. Brock, can you give us an idea of what age range you're looking at, just so that way we can make sure that we get those included?
5 and 2.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Cool.
There's another question that we have that came in through the email.
Cool.
Read. So one question I've been wrestling with that isn't exactly sex related in regard to isn't exactly sex related is regard to boundaries around child play. My daughters are 4 and 3, love to play princess and pretend to get married, and at the end they always kiss on the lips because that's what they see in the Disney movies. It's made me a bit uncomfortable, but I don't want to put my own baggage onto them. Are there general guidelines or phrasing you would use to make sure they both understand and follow physical boundaries without shame? I know it's innocent, but also don't know how to navigate it when their little brother gets old enough to play pretend, or if they are playing with other friends. So I keep getting this question too from other friends and this, and the kids will undress the Barbies and then they'll hump each other. Like they'll make the Barbies hump each other, or the Barbies will girl on girl kiss, and they are questioning what should I do here? So can you guys address that a little bit?
You want to start?
Oh, sure. So I think kind of going back to what I said before is have a conversation with them about it. Don't just let it float into nowhere, but actually take your child aside and say, why are they doing that? Why is that happening? Why do you think that they're doing that? They might say, oh, in the movies they kiss. Okay. Oh, so why do you think that happens in the movies? What are they expressing? Jocelyn mentioned earlier, it's an expression of love. And so talking about when should people kiss? When is there a good time for that to happen? Did that Barbie doll give that other Barbie doll permission to do that, or did that just happen? So it opens up the door for a lot of great conversations about relationships and about how to handle that, and in terms of even being concerned about how it's modeled for a younger child. Again, by having the conversation with the older ones to say, how do we want to model this as a family? By having that conversation, they may change their play a little bit, or it opens up the conversation to talk with that younger child as well to say, again, this is a very special activity that two adults do, and they really love and care about each other. And again, just really opening up the door for inserting your family values into what does this really look like?
Yeah, I think that I definitely agree with Julie. I think that this also sounds like a fantastic opportunity to start those conversations. I think that sometimes it can be challenging for us to find the right time. I hear that a lot when I'm talking to young people and their parents. I didn't know when to start. I didn't know how to open that up. In this situation, it really sounds and looks like this is a really good situation to kind of come in and talk about consent, to come in and talk about attraction, to come in and talk about how people are represented in digital media, even things like Disney movies, right? Is the idea that someone's going to come in and swoop you off your feet and rescue you, and this damsel in distress idea, what does that do to our daughters? Right? And then what also does that do to our sons? And so being able to open that dialogue up and really have that conversation, granted, the ages, right, that might be a little high level for some young people, but with the children being able to steer that conversation towards, like Julie said, did the Barbie tell the other Barbie that was okay? If not, well, what do you think prevented that? And if you get to, well, that Barbie didn't think about it. So what do you think the Barbie can do next time? That way Barbie 1, this gets confusing because they're both named Barbie. That way the Barbie that's not asking for consent can have that conversation. That way they can have that dialogue. What do you think that can happen differently in that next interaction? And then, okay. So being able to have that interaction and address that in a way that's both relevant to your family and cultural values, because I want to make sure that piece is stressed, because that's important. And then also making sure that that's not something that just gets let go, because there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? And you kind of address that in the question, but being able to identify and have that conversation now sounds like a really good opportunity. And then even when their little brother gets older and old enough to play, they may be able to help have that conversation with the little brother as well.
Cool. Any other questions? So Emma, you're gonna have us grab some books.
Yeah, if you go onto the bookshelf, so if anybody else has any more questions, feel free to add them. If you go to the bookshelf in the middle, down there are like some thin books.
Yeah.
There are a lot of like really thin books. Could you grab those really fast?
Yeah.
So, Brock, there are some books. Yeah. These books, How God Made Babies. So there are a number of them that address, especially for those like 2 to 5 year age. It's really cool. If you're looking for something faith-based that goes through, that you read with your kids, and it says, this is what your body is like, and this is what your sexual functioning is like, but it does it age appropriately. So that could be something cool for you all to do, given the ages, the 5 and 2, that you can sit down and do with your kids, where you're exploring together. They can ask questions. It's age appropriate, and it's not a book that you just read and then go and talk to them about, but something that you guys can do at like before they go to bed or something. I don't know, as a story time. So I wanted to, since those were there and they're around the same age, those can be really cool books. And then there are other ones, of course, that aren't faith-based, but yeah, that might be something that's helpful.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good books, especially when they get to like able to read or around ages like I think 8 to 12, somewhere around there, that I can include in a resource list that in the vlog that we'll do later. Kind of at the end, we can run a list down of some of those resources.
Cool. All right. Well, if there are not any other questions, then we wanted to give you guys a special offer. So thank you so much for participating with us and just taking the time to really learn about this stuff. It's so important, and I'm excited that you guys are present for this, that you get to share some of your knowledge with your kids and hopefully with others around you as well. So for your participation, we just wanted to offer you 50% off your first session with us. So if you want to continue this conversation, if you have another sexual issue that you are wanting to work on, anything of that nature, we wanted to offer you 50% off your first session with us. So sorry. And so this expires on October 19th. So that gives you 2 weeks to contact our office manager, Angela. Her information's there. It's also on our website to schedule the appointment. And we'd be happy to give you 50% off your first session with us. So
I also want to mention, I think I'm being really controlling. I don't know. But one of the cool pieces that Jocelyn and Julie have and that we have in our practice, especially for you all if you're wanting information about kids, and we know that kids can keep you home a lot of the time, so you can't get out of childcare as a problem or whatever. We offer online therapy, and that can be really helpful for when the kids go to bed. You can do a session with Jocelyn or Julie or any of us really. But that could be a really great opportunity if you're looking to, have more of a guided conversation with Jocelyn or Julie around this. You could do this from the comfort of your home while not needing to find childcare necessarily. So that can be a really great option for you if it's something that you're looking for, if it's really difficult just to leave too. So
Julie and I also wanted to mention before we kind of wrap everything up, that if there's anything we didn't cover, or if there's something that you feel you want more information on, feel free to send an email to Emma, respond to us, get in contact with us somehow, and let us know what information it is that you'd like. We recognize that even if we don't have the information, we have resources where we can find it pretty quickly. And so we can, get together a video blog that we can put up. That way a lot of people can gain access to that information, because ultimately we want to make sure that you have what you need. And if there's something that we are able to help you with in a broad format that's not so specific to your individual situation, we want to be able to get that out to you. And so we're definitely able to put together a short vlog and get that out online.
Awesome. Oh, one more. Oh, good. Absolutely. It's our pleasure. So
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for participating, and hopefully we'll see you again next month for whatever we come up with next.
Thanks, Jocelyn and Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.